Welcome to Abolition Lessons here on the Schools Not Prisons podcast. Remember, there's no need to take an assigned seat. There will be no tests, no grades, and definitely no detention. All you need is an open mind. Founded in 2016, Schools Not Prisons is part of a larger movement to examine the history of the prison industrial complex and how oppression in all its forms has worked to criminalize young Black and brown people across the United States. I'm your host, Irene Franco Rubio, and this is the Schools Not Prisons podcast. Welcome to the fourth day of Abolition Lessons here on the Schools Not Prisons podcast. Last time on the Schools Not Prisons podcast, we spoke with Raul Armenta about radical love and learning. Tune into that episode, subscribe to Schools Not Prisons, leave a review, and share with a friend. Today, we will be discussing intersectional feminism. Class is now in session. Today, we're joined by Janet Asante, who is the media coordinator at Dignity and Power Now and Justice LA. Dignity and Power Now is a Los Angeles-based grassroots organization founded in 2012 that fights for the dignity and power of all incarcerated people, their families, and communities. Their mission is to build a Black and brown-led abolitionist movement rooted in community power to achieve transformative justice and healing justice for all. Welcome, Janet, to the Schools Not Prisons podcast.
Yeah, so glad to be here.
Okay. Well, yeah, thanks, Janet, for being here. Can you tell the audience a little bit about yourself so we can know more about you?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I define myself as a creative in many different forms. I was previously mostly focusing on writing. I did a lot of poetry. I still do, but I find myself now as a media coordinator for Justice LA, which is a coalition of a lot of different organizations, really just honing in on comms and how to communicate our messaging.
Awesome. And what really brought you to this space? I know you got involved in LA movements broadly, but what brought you to movements on liberation and challenging incarceration and that sort of thing?
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like I've been asked this question before in different forms, and really what I like to draw from is radicalization. I feel like when somebody is radicalized and they become quote unquote woke and start to really see the ways that different types of injustices affect us in our daily lives, it compels you to do something about it. And that's the case for me as well. There's things that I can think about as terms of incarceration in my family or people who have been harmed by police violence or just being impacted by the system at large. That could be my why as to why I come to this movement. I think also exposure, being exposed to the goings on of what people are doing. And, hey, can you show up here? Can you do this? Can you help us with this? That's really my why.
Yeah.
Is that a coherent answer?
Yeah.
I just want to.
Yeah, no, I think that works. I think I do want to know a little bit more about how your understanding of these ideas came to be. And I know we kind of explored that too with the readings. But just like you and your positionality, I think being a Black woman in this space also really means something. And so what that has done for you and understanding how you want to show up for others who are impacted by similar things, or just broadly how you've kind of approached it.
Yeah, absolutely. I will say that knowledge has really been power for me. All of that background information, being a Black woman and moving through the world as a Black woman, and my family connection to being system impacted is one thing, but really having the knowledge to know that here are the targets, here are the people that have the power to make the changes, and how do we move those people? That came from learning history, that came from learning from our ancestors, that came from also getting involved with Dignity and Power Now when I was in college.
Oh, wow.
I started out actually wanting to be a veterinarian when I was in college. I've always been a math and science person, but I started to become radicalized and really dig into the policy analysis and eventually change my major to start digging into the economics and politics of the world.
Right.
And then when I wrote my thesis on abolition, it was very strongly connected to my time as a legal intern at the Texas Innocence Network.
Okay.
My mom's an attorney, and I have a lot of that background within me. It's just how I move through the world in a very politically analytical way. And so once I started to learn how Texas was just killing people that they knew were innocent,
Mm-hmm.
you know, and incarcerating folks that they know just need resources,
Mm-hmm.
letting people starve who they know need food, right?
Mm-hmm.
Those are the types of things that are radicalizing, and really brought me into the movement work.
Yeah, no, and I share a similar sentiment. I think in just hearing you recall how you kind of emerged, I feel like I had a very similar sort of political awakening that occurred, and it typically happens in college for most people. I think because at that point we're like starting to engage with new ideas, or we're thinking beyond the confines of like the neighborhood we grew up in. So yeah, I just share overall like sentiments on just what it means to be a young woman of color, and how that the world sees you and how you see the world, and then how that plays a role in how you choose to engage. And I think, you know, your mom's role throughout your life, I'm sure, has played something. So overall, I just feel like, yeah, I totally see what you mean and where you're coming from. I'm curious to know about like how that emerged in LA, being someone from Texas, and being like in that world. Again, two different sort of political playgrounds, I guess, if you would say. So yeah, how did that kind of show up in Los Angeles? Because I feel like abolition in LA is different from abolition in Texas or in Arizona, that kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, all my life I've been involved in like political efforts.
Mm.
And it was never what I thought I would do as a career. It just seemed like my side passion, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
this is who I am personally, but I'm gonna be a math and science
Yeah.
career type person. That ended up not being the case. But um I would say being in Texas can be very demoralizing if you're doing movement work.
Yeah.
I feel like, especially during COVID, I was working with an organization called Deeds Not Words.
Mm-hmm.
And typically, what Deeds does is they mobilize people across the state to come to the Texas legislature, and really be advocating during the legislative session for different things like reproductive rights, for example.
Mm-hmm.
And because of COVID, the Texas legislature just decided, well, you're not allowed to come here and speak anymore. Even though we like don't believe in COVID, we're doing all of these things to not protect you from it.
Right.
We're going to be using that as an excuse to, you know, prevent folks from having access.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't really matter if you want to, you know, appeal someone's case, for example, who has new evidence proving that they, you know, may be innocent of a crime that they were convicted for example, because the Texas appellate court just decided that they don't hear any cases that have to do with XYZ, right? So I think that it's those moments that can make you feel like you're on a hamster wheel.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas when I came to LA, I was able to see the real push and the real I will say institutional changes that folks here have been able to gain.
Yeah.
And it's a lot more, it builds a lot more what we call like animo, like where you're excited and you have a belief that you will win, and you believe that what you're doing will lead to success in your campaigns. So I will say I'll never abandon the South. I'll never abandon Texas, and we will fight for justice everywhere. And also being in LA has definitely built my optimism around what is possible.
Yeah, so Janet, can you tell us a little bit more about the work that you do at DPN and what your role entails?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm the Justice LA Media Coordinator at Dignity and Power Now. Justice LA is a coalition of a lot of different organizations. Some of them are national, like ACLU, the Vera Institute for Justice, and some of them are more local. And Dignity and Power Now is LA based, and we also have a branch in Philly as well. And so the work that I do at Dignity and Power Now is mostly centered around bringing the stories of our impacted people in our communities, and exposing the larger population to them, whether that's doing media campaigns, whether that's doing, you know, press conferences with people who have lost loved ones inside, or if we're doing graphics and toolkits to get the word out about a certain motion that we want people to advocate against. So that's a lot of the work that I do. I would say at DPN, I'm specifically focused on, you know, our directly impacted population when that comes to programming like healing and families, and our forever rooted cohorts, which are formerly incarcerated. And at Justice LA, it's more policy and advocacy based. So we're doing a lot of the political movement work.
Okay. And what do you feel like being engage with directly impacted populations has done for you in your understanding of this work, and seeing abolition become a tangible idea? Like, has it been informed and guided by the people that you're working with on a day-to-day basis, or like how does that show up for you?
I'm so glad you asked that question. I would say on the days where I start to feel like we are in this very oppressive environment where the system is constantly trying to shift itself back to the status quo, it's the directly impacted people that keep me going, that keep me feeling like we're not on a hamster wheel. We are moving towards progress. And that's because you can directly see the difference that the impact that I have on folks' lives. When I meet someone like Robin Williams, who is formerly incarcerated, she was one of the people who I reached out to on behalf of Dignity and Power Now, just to have a conversation, just to see, were her needs being met after she went through our Forever Rooted, formerly incarcerated program. And it was through speaking to her that I realized there's a story to tell. And that story that she has of being in and out of, incarceration, and then finally being given resources through the Office of Diversion and Reentry. And that story speaks to a larger phenomenon of how we take care of each other in the world. And so I would say that the policy and advocacy is fueled by these directly impacted people and their stories.
And just to dive in a little bit more on Robbins, and I know we did a whole storytelling campaign on her, but can you tell us more about the program that she went through and how that, like, I feel like that was a really pivotal, I guess, turning point for DPN, and really centering and showing here is a tangible thing that we can do and implement into society, and how we can dismantle sort of ideas of needing to incarcerate people.
Yeah, absolutely. So specifically in Los Angeles County, what we fight for at Justice LA is alternatives to incarceration and abolition. So what that means is divestment from carceral things like police and prisons and jails, and an investment in community-based care. And what that looks like is housing. It looks like mental health care. It looks like, permanent support. It looks like taking care of the community. And so the Office of Diversion and Reentry is a great example of what that can mean in a very tangible and programmatic way. So the Office of Diversion and Reentry supported Robin after she was unhoused. And this is a mother, this is a grandmother who, for over a decade, she had been incarcerated for a number of different charges. The one that she was finally incarcerated on before she got to ODR, she stole some food from like a 7-Eleven. She was hungry. She was living out of her car. And what she needed was not to be held in a cage.
Right.
She needed to receive mental health care, and specifically really have an opportunity to be supported on her basic needs to address the root cause of her incarceration. This cyclical, recidivism is a word that a lot of people say, we need to end recidivism. And the way that we end recidivism is by addressing the root causes of incarceration, which is that we are not supporting our communities. And so the Office of Diversion and Reentry offers housing, offers mental health care, offers a lot of programming to do the healing work that we need in our communities. And it completely changed Robin's life. And I'm so glad that we got to work with Revolve Impact, because telling that story in such a powerful way, using the tools that you all have, has been just so incredible. And now Robin has, I don't know if I haven't told you this, but I've spoken to Robin many times since Community Care Works, and, we're always talking. And she has become so empowered to then go and do the policy work.
Wow.
So now she's showing up, talking to folks in the county, advocating on behalf of the work that she does, to really spread the word about what a difference it can make to be supported. And that changed Robin's life, but that also changed her children's life, that changed her grandchildren's life, that changed the lives of everyone around her. Sorry, I'm rambling.
No, that's great. I feel like this idea of the cycle of recidivism, and I mentioned that because for like our listeners, that, and correct me if I'm wrong, but this idea of recidivism is the cycle of once you're incarcerated, you're going to be kind of forced to commit a crime again, and you're going to go back into prison, and it's going to be an endless cycle, and then that impacts generations, right? I think Robin has the example of literally empowering someone to recognize their sort of political consciousness, but also being able to help others realize that too, is precisely what, the work that you're doing is for, and why you're doing it. And I think it's important to note too that as Robin is a Black woman who's being empowered by yourself, another Black woman, and being in a space where I think generally women of color, and Black women in particular, are at the center of this work. I think others as well, but at its core, why is it that women in particular are being sort of incarcerated at much higher rates at this point, in contrast to men? But also it's like an increasingly sort of group that's continuing to lack the access to, whether it is everyday support services or just being able to live a quality life. Why is it, do you think, at this point, being at DPN, find yourself around a lot of other women who are being criminalized for simply trying to live?
Mm-hmm. I think there's a great question there, and I would say I'll always tie it to money, right? The reason for the mass incarceration that we see today is because that's what we are investing in. We are investing in the incarceration of what are actually societal failures and failures of the state. And when it comes to women and Black women specifically, we are seeing that time and time again, the growth of the incarceration of that population specifically is tied to even more drastic failures of the state. And what I mean by this is to get to like specifics, is that when we look at, the salary of just one LASD deputy, right? Let's say they're also getting overtime. This can be hundreds of thousands of dollars, potentially up to, $300,000, $400,000 if they're also getting contracts from different contract cities that pay LASD for their services, right? So that's the officer. Then we get into the facilities. Then we get into, whatever else they ask for, robot dogs, drones, militarization, tanks, whatever it is, right? So billions of dollars are going to LASD just for that. And then we get into the settlements. Every time that they brutalize someone, every time that they kill someone, every time that they take pictures of someone who died and spread them on social media, all of these wrongful death lawsuits, all of these really horrible situations that they're inflicting on our community, we pay for those settlements. That doesn't come from the officers' paychecks themselves. So that is what we're choosing to invest in. If somebody doesn't have the money to support their child, let's say it's a Black woman who doesn't have the money to support their family, we would rather pay someone else to take care of that child than actually support that family, and that's a problem. We would rather pay for somebody to be incarcerated 10 times than spend the initial fraction of the cost to really support them. So just to like zoom it out to the larger issue, that's what I feel like it is. And Black women and women in general are the cornerstone of our communities. When you speak to people who are at MCJ, at Men's Central Jail on visitation days, there's only 2 days out of the week that they're allowed to do visitation. It is women. By and large, I've gone there many times, and it is almost always somebody's mother, somebody's girlfriend, somebody's wife who is there supporting the person who is incarcerated. And that's really an indication of who is actually taking care of us. And it's not LA, it's not our cities, it's not our county.
And as you engage in this space and you're seeing and identifying women are always at the forefront, how do you really understand what intersectional feminism is and how it shows up in this work? I feel like as I engage in conversations on abolition, I think people often want to kind of silo abolition as its own thing, not existing in tandem with other systems. And by that, I mean like, for instance, immigration also being an abolition issue, or in this case, abolition being a feminist issue. And so how can we start to think more about how these issues are interconnected, and in particular, how intersectional feminism shows up in abolitionist spaces, whether that is having women at the forefront or you engaging, in protests of these things. How does that show up up to this point and how you've seen it?
Yeah, absolutely. I want to first say that it does show up because I think a lot of people see abolition as an academic topic.
Mm-hmm.
They see it as something that is potentially, confusing, reserved for folks who have a degree, when really it's like the most confusing thing is our current system. Our status quo doesn't make any sense. When we see people who are unhoused, we should house them. We see people who, are hungry, we should feed them. And that's the obvious answer. And that's what abolition means. So when we look at how Kimberly Crenshaw defines intersectionality, right? It's the compounding of a lot of different identities that cause, you can't really just look at one form of oppression outside of the other ways that these different identities really interact.
Yeah. What factors do you think tend to push women into the prison system, whether that be by association to a family member or being incarcerated themselves?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the organizations in the Justice LA Coalition is the SE Justice Network. And SE really highlights the piece around Black women specifically and women at large. One of the things that they are often saying is that, 1 in 4 women has a loved one who is incarcerated, and almost 50% of Black women have a loved one who is incarcerated. And you would never just guess that.
Yeah.
But when you think about the way that in the ways that women really care for our communities, it starts to really paint a broader picture. And one of the leading causes of incarceration is access and poverty. And it's really unfortunate, but essentially what happens is that when people are supporting so many different threads, you're juggling so many different things, it takes very little for someone to end up in the system.
Yeah.
When someone is supporting entire households on, one paycheck, a lot of times, it really doesn't take much for someone to end up involved in the system, right? If you have, 3 different kids that you're taking to 3 different schools, like my mom was, you get pulled over for speeding.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's something that, has happened to her, right? Or if you're trying to support a lot of different family members who are incarcerated, you might be stretched really thin. And that's the kind of desperation that our society leads us to, is how people end up incarcerated in the first place. And yes, women are very strong. Yes, we do support our communities, and also we're human. And that leads to a lot of different things. In Robin's case, she just needed to eat. She didn't have even the space and the support to be supporting other people, because she had gotten to a point where she was so unsupported that it was the basic needs of needing to eat. In the case of one of our directly impacted Forever Rooted members at DPN, her name is Robin Williams, and she experienced a cycle of incarceration due to her circumstances of, socioeconomic status and also being a Black woman. And having your basic needs met is a necessity. And when you don't have those needs met, that's what leads into cycles of incarceration. When she was finally arrested, before she received the resources through the Office of Diversion and Reentry, she was arrested for shoplifting food. And that is a great indication of what leads women to be incarcerated. It's survival.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of different ways in which that pans out in a lot of different people's stories.
Yeah.
But I highlight Robin's story specifically because it is just such a great example of what it means to be supported and unsupported. When she was unsupported, she was in a cycle of different charges and different stints of incarceration. And when she finally got that support through the Office of Diversion and Reentry, through housing and mental health care, she was then able to support her children and her grandchildren and her community at large, because she now assists with other people's care and assists other people through her job with receiving housing and mental health care.
And I feel like in the case of Robin, you mentioned the sort of ripple effect that in her being invested in and cared for, it's really demonstrating what it looks like to invest in community care and not invest in funding police and policies that are oppressive, and instead moving towards a way of life that really centers the experiences of just being able to live a life of quality and of dignity. And I think in thinking about Robin's story, it is a clear example of what intersectionality means and looks like, right? Because she is a Black woman, she is low income, she is all these things that exist at one time. And when those things coexist simultaneously, the system, or rather the state, doesn't necessarily know how to handle intersectionality, right? And they don't know what it means to care for families or to care for the well-being of one's life, and how that can like really invest in the community altogether. So I feel like, yeah, it's just a good example of what it means to envision a way forward that allows us to center investing in one person, and what that could mean. And on the note of Robin, do you feel like your engagement at DPN has allowed you to engage with a lot of Robins, right? Like who have different stories and experiences that may demonstrate different intersections. And so I'm wondering, is there sort of other sort of increasing like intersections that exist in the work that you do, whether it is experiencing poverty or houselessness, or how these things kind of exist at once?
Absolutely. And I think I've spoken a lot about how poverty and socioeconomic status can play a role in being incarcerated. But like you said, it's very intersectional, right? So one story that I think speaks to the ways in which these intersections really highlight how it's not just one size fits all is the death of Stanley Wilson Jr. Dr. Pulani Lucas is his mother. She is very highly educated, very degreed. They are very successful. Stanley Wilson Jr. played for the Detroit Lions in the NFL. But he developed mental illness. He developed a mental illness, which led to him being incarcerated in Twin Towers facility here in Los Angeles. And eventually, LASD reported that during the transfer to a medical facility, he passed away. They did not include his death on the LASD inmate death tracker that they were forced to implement this year. He died February of 2023. And despite, his status as a former NFL player, despite the education of his mother, he was still a Black man incarcerated. And that led to his death not only occurring, but also not even being counted.
Right.
And when you look deeper into the story, there's a lot of inconsistencies that LASD reports about his death. And I won't get too into it just because it's pretty dark. But I will say that really highlights how, when it comes to the system and the ways in which it perpetuates harm in our communities, these are the boxes that are checked. When I think about Helen Jones, she's a DPN staff at Dignity and Power Now. She has been leading the work around the connection between the Los Angeles Sheriff's Department and the coroner's office. And all of that started because her son, John Horton, was killed inside of Men's Central Jail by LASD gang members in 2009.
Yeah.
So because of this one incident that happened to her, she has been a fire and a storm to really lead folks to do the deeper investigating. She has been pivotal to having the Civilian Oversight Commission really look into the deputy gangs, to even coin the term deputy gangs, to really examine the 3,000 boys who are on the third floor at Men's Central Jail. She has led Dignity and Power Now to start working with researchers at UCLA to really observe the different autopsies that come out of the coroner's office. And what we found is that there is a long list of folks who are labeled as their death is categorized as a natural death or inconclusive. And these are people who are, our age. They're in their 20s.
Yeah.
These are people who would, arguably just have been perfectly healthy. So there's really nothing natural about dying at 24, from a heart attack. Right. And so really having this one mother and the pain that she felt from losing her son, John Horton, in March 30th, I believe, 2009, has led to so many years later. Look at the ripple effect of that.
Right.
Just not even just the families, the advocacy that she has led with the Check the Sheriff Coalition, with Justice LA, with Dignity and Power Now. the ways that people's individual experiences speak to the larger advocacy is why I do the work. And it's what helps me show up to work every day to continue those efforts.
Yeah. And just to provide some clarity as we're thinking about these two examples. So one is this former football player who was incarcerated, was a Black man, had the background that you would think would be, I guess, more so prioritized in the eyes of the state. And then there's the life of the young man who, Helen Jones? His son was murdered, right? So you have these two sort of contrasting stories, similar positionalities, that kind of, I guess, demonstrate the sort of spectrum of what it means to allow for death to happen within the prison. So correct me if I'm wrong, that it's like being able to understand how the state is playing a force in killing, right, or murdering young men in prison by not providing them with access to the services that they need or equitable conditions to survive, and that's resulting in sort of mass deaths that aren't being counted and that are being reported as natural. And so in doing so, seeing that all the time, I'm sure, in the work that you engage in can be, I guess, detrimental to your understanding of how people are valued or seen in the eyes of the state when they're in a cage, and what that could mean. Could you provide a little bit more of like understanding on how that shows up? I think Helen Jones is a prime example of someone who was moved to action because it directly impacted her. But what about for a lot of folks who feel like, oh, this issue is totally unremoved to my life and to anything that I engage in? How can they start to see that, no, these have very real implications for how we all get to exist on a day-to-day basis in America, right? I think one thing I'd like you to touch on is how sort of the prison industrial complex as a system informs your understanding, Helen's understanding, our sort of collective understanding of what it means to be in abolitionist movements and how that drives us.
Absolutely. Our current system is a carceral system, and even as we make progress, it has this muscle memory that is always going to try and draw itself back to the status quo, back towards, a proliferation of cages and incarceration and surveillance, right? Justice LA, one of our biggest wins as a coalition has been killing the contract to expand the jail system in LA County. So a few years ago, in 2017, there was this contract to expand the women's jail specifically, to build an expansion and an entirely new facility, right? That was supposed to be, state of the art. That contract was already signed. And there's a lot of folks in the county that said, well, it's a done deal. You can't come to us and say this is, against the community's values right now. We've already signed the contract. But it was because of the community coming together and seeing how multifaceted the issue is that we were able to kill that contract and get all of the Board of Supervisors to agree to close Men's Central Jail down. And I'll explain. Decarceration is a gender justice issue. It's a racial justice issue. It's an environmental issue. It's a labor issue. And there are a lot of reasons why all of the different organizations that became a part of Justice LA joined. When you think about the ground that this facility was going to be built on, it was contaminated. There was a lot of poison in the ground. So even if the facility was built, it was going to be continuously poisoning the people inside. When you think about specifically our TGI and LGBTQ community who are incarcerated, there is an inherent violence of the ways that our facilities are gendered in the first place, but also the ways that folks just don't receive the care that they need.
Right.
So that's another thing. For folks who think that, incarceration, abolition isn't an issue that affects them at all, you're wrong. I mean, first and foremost, wherever you live, I would almost guarantee that about half of your budget, whether that's your city or your county or your state, is going towards carceral systems. And when you think about everything else that you wish had more funding, that's where the funding could go. Whether you believe in the expansion of our libraries, whether you believe in, more after-school programs, more funding to provide teachers' salaries, these are the things that are being underfunded to support our carceral system. So we're spending billions of dollars, and all of these police departments, if crime is down, they're going to ask for more money. If crime is up, they're going to ask for more money.
Right.
The money will never stop going to them, and they will always get it unless we resist. And so whatever you care about, whatever you wish had more funding, it should be divested from these carceral systems and supporting what our communities actually need.
Right.
And so that's some of what occurred when our county voted for Measure J. And Measure J in 2020, which really meant that a certain percentage, 10% of our county's budget, should be going directly towards alternatives to incarceration and community-based care.
Right.
So that's what we mean when we say, care first. Yeah. Care first, jails never. And now we're seeing that when you really care for communities, you don't need jails.
Yeah.
You don't need prisons.
Yeah.
When you care for schools, you don't need jails. You don't need prisons. Yeah. And so, so when you fund schools, you don't need jails. You don't need prisons. And so that is why it's everyone's problem that we're giving billions of dollars towards these jails and towards LASC and LAPD and all of these different police unions.
And as you've come to understand it now, and I feel like this is a question that often emerges on like people trying to understand these ideas is like, oh yeah, the state is investing in these things and we kind of just accept it as fact. But as you've come to understand it, what is the interest of the state in investing in prison versus schools versus really everything else? Like, why are they so fixed on this idea of, like, if we incarcerate more Black and brown people, then what? Like, how does the state perceive this idea? How do you perceive it? Like, how has it informed how you engage in the work?
Yeah, first I want to draw your attention to what's the end goal here, right? Like, why are they incarcerating people? How can this possibly make sense based on what we know our community needs and what we know works? And the answer is that it doesn't make sense. And that's what we need to have people exposed to. And that's what's really radicalizing, is that people will say, well, if we do abolition, then what? How does this make sense?
Right.
And the truth is that it makes a lot more sense than just caging people.
Yeah.
Where's the end goal?
Yeah.
People are constantly going to re-enter the system as much as we are caging them, as much as they are being deprived of their resources, as much as the entire family system is disrupted. If one mother is incarcerated, where do her children go? What are we then funding? If somebody's having a mental health crisis, you can call a police officer to be there. Can you call a mental health care practitioner?
It's like forcing people to think within the confines of what currently exists and not allowing us to think in terms of really centering, what community care looks like and this world of why do we not have access to a mental health professional if we know that certain communities are in need of it more than others. I guess as I start to understand abolition more and more through these conversations, I think it's something that I'm also trying to visualize and also trying to really conceive to be able to explain to others, like, this is the world that we're trying to create. Here's what it looks like and what it entails. What does it look like to you?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what it looks like is, first and foremost, taking care of each other. Autonomous communities are beautiful, and that is true for a reason. When we look at our jail population, specifically in LA County, this is the largest jail system in the world, right? And supposedly the blue haven, right? The blue state of California being, the most liberal, has the largest jail system in the world.
Wow.
And 50% of that population is there with severe mental illness. And there's a lot of stories that I can tell about families who say, I've been trying for years to get help for my son. Should I just let him be arrested? Maybe he'll receive care inside. That's a genuine sentiment that I've heard from families before who are desperate to get care. Twin Towers Medical Facility is the largest mental health care resource that we have in the state. Twin Towers, which is a jail.
Yeah.
And why don't we have a facility or many community-based facilities with a lot of service providers providing care for our communities? Where's the funding for that? And so what abolition looks like for me is caring for people so that they never enter the system in the first place. And also, if folks end up causing harm, how do we address the root causes of those harms? And that's something that we're just not doing today. Yeah. And we know that our current system not only doesn't work in terms of what it claims to do, right, to prevent crime, to prevent harm. We know that doesn't work, right? So let's start there. So if we're going to address the harms in the first place, let's say it addresses the harms. We know that's also not true. We know that it perpetuates harm. We know that it destabilizes communities. We know that it impoverishes people. And abolition is centered around caring for our communities. We just aren't doing those things.
Mm-hmm.
And I know it sounds so simple. It's like
Yeah.
people sometimes want a really complicated answer.
Right.
And I can give you one. I can say, look at the Men's Central Jail closure report. Look at the Alternatives to Incarceration Work Group report. Look at all these details of where we're moving dollars from A to B. But long story short, we're putting money into caging people. We're putting money into new forms of incarceration, like electronic monitoring and e-shackles and ways to incarcerate people within their homes, when all of the funding that goes towards those things could really be used to support each other. And there's enough resources to go around that we support each other. But we have Freedom Harvest, which takes place outside of a lot of different facilities, especially the women's facility out in Linwood, where families can come and be supported and be given different forms of healing by the DPN healing team.
Oh, wow.
So that looks like, massages or Reiki or, essential oils and things like that to support families as they are visiting their family members inside.
Nice.
And during COVID, especially, reaching out to folks inside was restricted. And sometimes they would just cancel your ability to see someone. Sometimes they would say, oh, there's just no phone calls. And so even if folks were just stopped at the door from being able to speak with their family members, they would be supported by the DPN healing team. So that's Freedom Harvest.
Oh, that's so cool.
Yeah.
And so it happens to be that most of them are moms.
It almost always is mothers.
Oh. And just thinking about the work that DPN is constantly doing and that we'll be doing next year. Oh, I shouldn't have said next year. Down. Never mind. This is 2024. Okay. Yeah. So in thinking about the work that DPN is doing and will continue to be doing, what are some ways that everyday people can engage in the work that you're doing, whether it is just educating people or gaining a greater understanding themselves of what abolition and incarceration looks like, and how they can engage in that sort of work?
Absolutely. Well, if you live in Los Angeles, I would definitely say get involved with Justice LA. We're on Instagram, Twitter, Blue Sky, TikTok. We have link trees at all of those platforms. And you can join our virtual action team or join our newsletter where you can see what's coming up, what actions are coming up. How can you mobilize to support families? Is there a vigil where you can show up and support families? And we'll be having a really big action on January 30th at the Board of Supervisors due to the in-custody deaths that have happened this year. We're at a record number. I believe that there was 3 in the last week in LASD custody. We also always have a protest on March 30th at the Board of Supervisors at around 9 a.m. to commemorate the MCJ Closure Workgroup Report, which came out on March 30th, 2021, which outlined how to close Men's Central Jail in 18 to 24 months, which of course hasn't happened yet. So we always want to commemorate that date to show how little progress the Board of Supervisors has made.
Oh, wow. No, that's amazing. Yeah. I will totally be there. I think in thinking about just altogether, like I've learned so much about why you show up in this work, how you do it, and how you're constantly moved to continue moving forward, even when things can seem like they're not moving at all. I just wanted to kind of bring us back to kind of ground you as well, and from your book as like what grounded you in the beginning as a sort of young activist and what has come to really inform the work that you're doing. So is there anything that has provided you with some sort of like, this is the foundational thought or underlying thing that really continues to move you forward? Maybe it's something that you did learn from this book or generally as you've engaged with members that you're seeing the real impact of the work that you're doing.
Absolutely. I mean, in the spirit of intersectional feminism, I think about, my mother and the values that she instilled in me that allowed me to be radicalized in the first place. The value of community, the value of taking care of each other, the ways that she supported so many people, so many family members that, stayed with us for a few weeks, a few months, a few years. The ways that, Black women have really been the cornerstone of believing and caring for our communities. And that is how I show up. Myself as, Janet Asante, the reason why I do this work is because I believe that it is my mission and part of my existence to be an effective change maker towards progress. And that progress looks like abolition. That is the only way for us to move forward and to truly be free, is to tear down the system that we know was created to oppress. So yeah.
No, it's beautiful, Janet. Thank you. And I think on that note, is there anything that you would like to sort of leave with young listeners who are like either learning to engage in this space or learning these ideas that feel similar sentiments, right, about the way that their families inform their understanding of themselves and the world and how that occurs for them? Is there sort of any key takeaway, if anything, either as it pertains to intersectional feminism or just movements broadly, that you hope listeners will take away with them?
Absolutely. I will say, don't feel like abolition is exclusive to academics. Don't feel like you need to know everything to get involved. You know why it's important, whether that's just a feeling that you have, a situation that you witness, that you realize, wow, there's nobody I can call for this. There's nobody I feel safe reaching out to for this situation, or my state is failing me and providing me resources in the predicament that I'm in. You don't have to be an expert to join the movement. See how you can support, whether that's just joining virtual actions, which you can do from home. Yeah. You can send a text message. You can send a public comment. You can call into a meeting, see what organizers in your area are doing, and just support and show up in the ways that you can.
Wow. Love that, Janet. And I think that's such a key way for young people to think about their positionality in today's world, where it can seem like everything is overwhelming and the world is crumbling. Like, how do I show that I care and I want to make the world a better place? So I think, leaving those thoughts as ways to engage are really key. So thank you. I feel like this was such a great conversation. It's precisely what Schools Not Prisons is all about. It's being able to empower young people who aren't experts, and we're all learning. I'm learning, you're learning, and we're engaging in the space all the time. So thanks for being here.
And thanks for asking such incredible questions. Let's give it up for Irene.
Ooh, thank you. Yeah. Give it up for Janet. Okay. So we've learned that abolition is a way forward by eliminating incarceration, systems of oppression that harm these communities, and instead work towards creating a world that allows us to care for one another and centering community care as a way to move forward.